Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo. And how are you today?
I am great. I am great. A lot's going on. It's a beautiful spring-like day here in New York. I'm not taking it, to mean too much because I think we have more cold weather coming. It was freezing this weekend.
Oh, no.
Um, yeah, it was nuts. And then our big personal news is that we found out on Saturday or Friday actually that we got an apartment that we've been really wanting, and so we're moving in 2 weeks. So my life is sort of turned upside down for the next couple of weeks. In fact, so that's my little bit of news is for the next couple of weeks, we'll have a guest host in. Stay tuned for that to be sitting in for me while I do all things domestic. And then you also had some big news that you should share and talk about before we get into, the industry news.
Yeah, so I am excited about saying that I am looking actively at the vendor world. I've been an industry analyst for 17 years, and honestly, that was about 15 years longer than I had originally intended to be an analyst. I had fully intended to talk to a couple hundred companies and then join the startup that I thought was going to be the hottest and most interesting one. But I kept getting promoted, and then I ran firms and I kept having employees. And not that I didn't like doing the analyst work, but it started getting to the point where I felt like I was running the company more because it was something I was supposed to be doing rather than getting to dig in and work more deeply with tech products and getting to show people what is next and being able to implement what is next. So I'm looking forward to being able to get back into the game, so to speak, either in kind of a marketing or pre-sales role where I actually get to help customers to implement the next big thing. And I feel like there's a lot of next big things right now with AI happening to support IA and IT and operational technology and financial work, like across the board. There's so many new interesting things that are changing the way work is done, and I want to get more deeply hands-on in doing that work.
Well, I think it's courageous of you. You've been quite a leader in the industry analyst community, and I'm sure the industry from that standpoint will miss your voice. But I do think it's courageous to take that step from success. You've been very successful in this, and stepping out into the new space. And I think you're very much like me in that, or like we're on a very similar path. And I had the exact same sense. It's like there's all this going on, you're like itching. It's like you want to get out and you want to
Yeah.
be playing this game right now because there's so much going. And that's, I think if you're a CIO, if you're in the enterprise IT space, that should be exciting to you, right? Because there is so much happening and there's so much to keep track of. And I will tell you one other thing, and I guarantee you will find this when you do land wherever you end up landing is if I had any piece of advice for product managers, product marketing folks, after having now been in this role officially for a couple of months, unofficially for 6 months or so, is that I think everybody should take a stint as being an industry analyst, or at least learn how to think the way we were trained to think
Mhm.
as analysts, because it changes your outlook. It truly changes how you see things, and therefore how you approach it from the inside as within a tech company. And so you will be immensely valuable to any firm that is lucky enough to win you over, because it's an incredibly valuable insight and a view of the world that it is really easy to lose sight of when your entire world is inside the walls of a tech company. So good luck to you with that. It's going to be an exciting journey, and I guess we'll see what that does. And eventually that means this week in enterprise tech is going to be to insiders, so maybe we'll have to change our view of how we approach it. I don't know, we'll have to see.
Yes, hopefully we'll be able to stay unbiased, relatively unbiased, and perhaps bring in some new insights over time as well.
I think so. So speaking of unbiased, let's get to it. Let's get to the industry news, and really we should call this week in Google, Google Cloud specifically, because this last week was Google Cloud Next annual conference. And I'm going to lead off with a story. We're going to have like 5 different stories on Google here today, talking about what they did. But specifically, I want to use a piece of analysis by Tom Krazit from Runtime. We're big fans of his. He produces a bunch of really good, insightful, enterprise-focused analysis. And he pointed out a few things. The first is that the attendance of Google Cloud Next actually rose by 50% from 20,000 visitors or attendees rather to 30,000. That is not at all insignificant, and it speaks
Mhm.
volumes to sort of the state of play. And um, as as he points out, as Krasa points out, I think that what is interesting is we're in this really interesting period of almost a reset in terms of the impact that AI is having on the enterprise tech landscape. And to a certain extent, the market has sort of pivoted all the way back to, I think he Krauser is sort of making it sound like it favors Google. I don't know if I would go that far, but it has certainly leveled the playing field and given Google a second opportunity because they sort of missed the boat go round one when it came to the cloud and the enterprise space, right? They really ended up ceding that to both AWS, Amazon, and Microsoft via Azure, and they've always sort of been like this distant third. And there's an opportunity here for them to really get back into this game wholeheartedly. Although, as we talked about on the show, they've been sort of trailing behind on the AI side from OpenAI and Anthropic and vis-a-vis that Microsoft and Amazon. So I don't think this is a sure thing. I think, Krasnod is probably a little bit more bullish than I am in terms of it. But it is, I will say, in the literally last 2 months, I've seen some really positive signs, right? Some of their leadership in
Mhm.
terms of the things they're producing, some of what they're talking about. So I think I'm watching with I'm very interested, very curious, and sort of hopeful. Look, I think it's good for the industry if Google's a strong player here. So, I mean, that was we'll get into the details, but from broad strokes, I mean, what's your take on sort of where Google is playing and positioning here?
Yeah, I think that Google has been challenged because they honestly, when they first came out with Google Cloud, Google did not understand enterprise problems. The standard enterprise challenges go around, start with enterprise applications and relational databases and data warehouse, basically your source of truth and the key applications you use. And Google was always thinking an order of magnitude higher than that of how to connect a billion people together, just a challenge that most businesses, frankly, do not care about. And so Google was talking about everything at that scale. And it took a while for enterprise problems to scale up to the point where Google has always kind of made its bread and butter. But with the emergence of AI, everything is much more complicated. You use a lot more data, you use it more quickly. You start needing things like Kubernetes to a greater extent. You start needing global networks. You start needing to manage data at petabyte scale and do this on an ongoing basis in production. And Google is finally able to say, oh, great, here's all the stuff that we've been doing this entire time. And now we can start figuring out how to productize it.
Well, you might be being a little generous, in my opinion. I think there's a degree of hubris, right? Back when the cloud first hit, the cloud, Google was the 800-pound gorilla. They arguably still are the 800-pound gorilla, but they sort of had this attitude. I mean, they were doing this moonshot stuff, right? I think that they
Mhm.
even called them that, right? And 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 they sort of took this attitude. It's like, if it's good enough for us, it should be good enough for you. Don't
Mhm.
ask, And whereas people like AWS and Microsoft in particular, even more than AWS, in my opinion, to your point, really focused in and honed in on what are the problems that enterprise IT organizations are facing and how do we make their life simpler and easier, and not just sort of accept this, hey, just don't ask questions sort of thing. So I think it's in part what you said. I do think the challenges that the enterprise are facing in the era of AI are becoming more complex and are getting closer to sort of Google's strengths and sweet spots. But I also think that Google has, they got enough beatings that they have recognized that they got to play ball. And I think they've done a much better job of starting to speak enterprise language, coming up with pricing models that are much more amenable for the enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think it's a combination of both. And I do think, as you alluded to a moment ago, this at least some of the announcements we're going to highlight, I guess, are definitely sort of in line with that, right? There clearly some signaling here about making this more approachable for at least large enterprises. I still think they're not a great play if you're on the smaller end of the spectrum, but at least for large enterprises, they're a play. So we have 5 announcements we wanted to cover today. Pick which one do you want to start with?
Well, I'm going to start with one that most people don't think of with Google is that they announced a cloud wide area network. So to go work at global scale to be able to basically connect the world from a cloud perspective. And I think that's a really interesting one because it we don't think about connectivity as much as we think about storage and compute when it comes to an AI perspective. But the need for greater performance and the need to connect regions when you're allowed to connect data is incredibly important. And I think Google is finally able to take advantage of its own global network that it's had obviously for many years, and now being able to provide that as a product. I think this is a potential opportunity for Google to really own that area when there's kind of a vacuum in terms of leadership and product launches on the wide area network side.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. It's an area, to your point, we don't talk about networking almost at all. Like, for instance, on this show, it's sort of this way deep in the weeds thing. And I think what is also interesting is the cloud sort of changed the game. I mean, I cut my teeth. I spent decades focused on, network connectivity as a major bottleneck, a major challenge. I bought dark fiber back in the 90s. I mean, it was just,
Yeah.
it's always been the siege issue. And the cloud sort of changed a lot of it, where it's like all you need is an internet connection. And what I think is interesting about the whole AI era, and we've been talking about a combination, I think a little bit of a perfect storm here. One, there's been this increasing movement to the repatriation of cloud workloads, of recognizing that the costs don't always make sense. And so pushing them either back to truly on-prem or into like colo facilities. And colo facilities should have good interconnect services, but if you're a major enterprise and you're doing in, either a wholly owned center or whatever, you're now owning that challenge. And so this is one of them. They have what they're calling the cloud interconnect service. The combination of low cost, interesting, lower than a normal internet type connection, and low latency. I mean, that's going to be a pretty potent combination for organizations that have high bandwidth needs for those sort of interconnection type services. And then the other focus is, of course, branch and campus networks, which is still a major, major situation for if you're in retail, if you are doing banking, retail banking, anything where you have a bunch of offices or branch offices, still a pretty significant issue. So it is a very interesting play, and I think it speaks to the fact that the pendulum is swinging back, right? We're going to be talking more and more about AI on the edge, and these workloads traversing back out to the edge use cases, and that's going to just make the network all that more important again. I feel like
Yeah,
we've
and
seen the
I'm
story
just
back and
gonna
forth.
go out on this really quick, but one of the things that other things that Google brought up a lot is how they were moving AI back to the data center, how they are supporting other data sources that are not directly Google. Google is actually sounding a little bit of like IBM. Their innovation is moving things off of Google Cloud, which sounds funny. It's actually the right thing to do, but it's kind of funny saying we're going to the future by going on-prem.
Well, it is. It's. I mean, I think they are rightfully recognizing that based on where they're at, sort of in their cloud positioning, that they are well served by having a really strong play on hybrid cloud, multi-cloud type use cases, and increasingly. I mean, I've been making this case forever. It's not really even hybrid cloud; it's hybrid IT. It's this idea that you have workloads that traverse multiple cloud providers, on-prem, colo, everything, and to the extent that they can help facilitate that, it makes a lot of sense. Which leads to, so we don't spend too much time on one thing,
Yeah.
another one of their announcements, which is their unified security announcement, which is also sort of in the same vein. This idea of bringing everything together in this sort of abstraction layer to unify security across your entire platform. I'm not a security guy. I know you're not exactly either, but you probably have a better handle on it than me. I mean, how you want to summarize this for the audience and what you think about it?
Yeah, at the highest level, it's interesting to see how Google has brought together so many pieces of the puzzle. Security operations, of course, they've got the browser, threat intelligence, cloud native security with the acquisition that they have of Wix. Of course, they had previously acquired Mandiant. If you're a real security expert, you probably know a bunch of other pieces of the puzzle that Google's brought in place. But I think that it makes sense that Google has this global data fabric already. And we just talked about the networking piece of the puzzle, and being able to control and protect all of those aspects of the cloud ecosystem at one time, potentially under a single umbrella. It makes a lot of sense. And Google also being able to do this at a global scale. Again, a global provider.
And not insignificantly, also applying their Gemini AI product into it as a wrapper around this to as provide, as they're calling it, semi-autonomous AI capabilities. And I think this is not insignificant, because unlike anybody else in the security space, other than maybe a Microsoft or an Amazon, but anyone that's a pure play security play, they're going to end up relying on one of the foundational, frontier LLMs to try to execute. And so it's going to give Google a leg up here, because they're going to be able to tune their LLM natively directly to their unified security platform. And that's going to potentially make it a little bit more cohesive in their approach. So I think it's really interesting. I'm, like I said, I'm not a big security guy, but I think it's another smart play, and would also be very open. The one thing I will say this too, I am increasingly hearing from CIOs that I would say as long as, or as short of just a couple of years ago, people were pretty much, you were an AWS shop, you're an Azure shop. The rare one was an Oracle shop, right, or a Google shop. But increasingly, while I don't think the multi-cloud vision of people running workloads simultaneously on multiple clouds has ever really come to fruition, the idea of having multiple cloud providers for specific use cases has absolutely come to fruition. And so I think if you're someone like Google, that actually bodes very well for you. And this provides them this opportunity to create this peanut butter layer that sits on top of it all as a sort of this unified approach. And again, I think that's just a smart play for them. So, I guess we'll see, and maybe people that know more about security than you and I can weigh in with more detail. But it was
Yeah,
still an
but I
interesting
do
play.
think that, in that regard, Microsoft is obviously the 800-pound gorilla here. Probably something like $20 billion in security business, last I checked. Might be even higher than that at this point. And Google's got to be looking at that and saying, well, we do a couple billion a year in security, but why not? Why shouldn't we get our rightful share as a global cloud provider?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
So one of the other things that Google announced is something that, speaking of Microsoft, is a little bit of a catch-up play, in my opinion. But they're announcing what they called workspace flows, and it's basically a Gemini-based automation component, sort of similar. I mean, it sort of sits in the middle of what you can do with uh, custom GPT from OpenAI, and then the built-in components that like Microsoft has in using their Copilot in their Office suite. So it's sort of a mix of both of these, because you've got this automation layer, which I guess is also somewhat similar to what you can do with like Microsoft Copilot Studio, where you can build, although I would say from at least what we've seen in the announcement, relatively simplistic workflows. I mean, these are not horribly complex and not horribly AI focused. I would say these are more, I mean, in fairness, they call them workspace, right? They call them workflows. So more workflows than agentic AI, but definitely the ability to do this in a very simple format. And then they, sort of as part of the same thing, they've got all these components that are baked into Google Drive and Google Sheets, and I forgot what the word processor one is called, Google Docs. So it
Yeah.
has now all these elements baked into it. I don't use any of the Google products, but again, that's very similar, and in this way, it's very much catch up to what Microsoft has been doing. But again, some say they had to go. They need to get caught up here. They needed to have all these pieces, and the upside here is that by all what at least it seems that Gemini is a pretty significant step forward for them. And so
Mhm.
ostensibly this is all going to work much, much better because it's all built on the Gemini foundation.
Yeah, everybody always has complaints and issues with any new model that comes out, but I've actually found the latest Google Gemini models to be quite proficient in what they do. I think they kind of took some of the air out of the latest Meta Llama models, frankly, that came out because Gemini was outperforming Llama pretty consistently on tasks. And Google was showing that they are basically going head to head against Claude, which had their, Claude 3.7 has also been a very successful launch. But Google is basically able to go head to head. And I think that the flows are, as you said, it's kind of an embryonic step forward. It's not like Google is now ServiceNow all of a sudden, but it is helpful to have these workflows in place because honestly, a lot of the work that is going to happen in the enterprise is simply linking agents to workflows, being able to go back and forth, and then having agents workflow code and being able to go back and forth between those three modalities of work control and making them consistent. So Google needed this piece. Kudos to putting it in place.
Yep, agreed. All right, and the last announcement that we're going to cover from Google Cloud Next is the one that I'm most interested in, and that is that they announced a new interoperability protocol that they're calling agent to agent. Now, if you're keeping score, you might be a little confused because this is, I think, 3 weeks in a row we're talking about some form of an interoperability
new protocol.
effort.
Yes.
New protocol, yet another one. So just to kind of keep you up to speed, we talked a lot last week, and we'll talk about more in a second about Anthropic's Model Context Protocol, or MCP. The week before, we talked about agency, which is another collective effort, this one led by Cisco in coordination with Glean and I think it's LangChain, a few others. And so this is interesting. I think the most salient part is that agent to agent does not appear to compete with MCP. And in fact, Google also announced support of MCP. It would look to be complementary to MCP in that whereas MCP is really about the relationship between an agent and an underlying system of record, agent to agent, as its name would imply, is about the relationship between agent and another agent. So if in theory I have an agent that is using MCP to connect to a system of record to take some transaction and then needs support of something else, rather than directly connecting to that system of record, it might go to another agent who is accessing via MCP that other system of record, and it is handling effectively a load balancing kind of effort where we're handling off, or a mixture of experts sort of model. I mean, however you want to think of it, right? Where you have these different agents. And so there's lots of, I think what's interesting is it opens up sort of architectural opportunities about how you engineer these things. Now, I do think it's fairly competitive to agency, because agency was also about agent to agent interoperability. And they're taking fairly different approaches from what I can tell so far. And I haven't really dug deep into the covers here of agent to agent yet, but it does look very interesting. I will say, whereas agency seemed to sort of whimper out of the gate with a very small number of sort of sponsoring companies and not a whole lot of clarity as to what it exactly was. Agent to agent announced with, I think, 50 sponsors. I think of this like in politics, like co-sponsors of the bill, a whole bunch of different people and major players, ServiceNow, Salesforce, a whole bunch of significant players as part of it. So quite interesting, and I think could be again another really big play for them if they are successful in making MCP and agent to agent the de facto pair. That would bode very well for Google. I mean, what was your take on it?
Yeah, so just looking at the Google blog, I'm going to give a selection of vendors that are partners because the entire list is too long. But Atlassian, LangChain, MongoDB, Salesforce, SAP, ServiceNow, Workday, basically creme de la creme of enterprise applications in the cloud. And then on the service provider side, Accenture, Capgemini, Cognizant, Deloitte, KPMG, McKinsey, basically everybody you would want on the consulting side that is going to build billion-dollar practices of AI. So obviously, this is going to have some immediate legs out of the gate. Even half these vendors are serious about supporting this. And what I also find interesting is that from a technical perspective, agent to agent isn't just looking at text agents, but also looking at video and audio, where Google has obviously been strong in creating AI models. And the idea of having this more holistic agent to agent capability is potentially really helpful in breaking these agentic silos. And I think this also might provide some room for additional players to come in and say, well, we're going to be agent to agent, but we're going to focus more on text because there are specific use cases that we think we can break the silos down on, and while maintaining the jargon for legal or medical or all of these other areas that do require very specific domain knowledge. So there's going to be room here for both general players and specific players. I think I could be wrong, but the agent to agent work seems complicated enough that there's not going to be one solution that can cover every enterprise scenario.
Well, and I do think, to a certain extent, this fits well with Google's strength, right? Google does play well the sort of big picture macro view. They haven't always done a great job of figuring out how to monetize and how to transform these into like legitimate products. But I think this is a nice fit for sort of their view of the world. And what I really appreciate about it is I think they're tackling it in the proper way, right? So one of the core tenets of the protocol of the agent agent is this idea of a discovery mechanism, or where an agent effectively advertises its capabilities. And this is something we've seen in other approaches in the past, and it's an extremely effective model because it has baked in scalability and it makes a ton of sense. And of course, they're also relying heavily on JSON as the foundational transport mechanism, again, a well-established industry standard. And so I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's going to sort of lay the foundation here. So I think it's a winner. I think they're going to have, they're going to have a lot of legs on this. And, the question will remain, does this actually help Google anything in any way other than saying, hey, we've established this? Does it actually have any market? I mean, because part of the whole thing is it's an open standard, which means AWS can sign up tomorrow and be an agent to agent player. And does that confer any advantage to Google? I don't know, but I feel like it's a good move, and I'm very intrigued. I will have a little quick sidebar comment on it, because I think they made the announcement. They made a big point of Accenture and Deloitte and KPMG, and I was chuckling just because I feel like, does that hold any weight anymore? I feel like every single announcement we see from any major player, it's always Accenture, Deloitte, and KPMG that have announced their support, and they're already doing it. So they're basically doing everything with everybody. So I don't know if that matters. I just thought it was funny.
I do feel like so whether I think Accenture and Deloitte are important, and we're going to get to this a little bit later in the show. I do think that when large consultancies put their eggs in a basket, they are expecting this to be something that can make them a lot of money. They're not going to bet on every startup that shows up or every protocol that shows up unless they think it can drive, call it $100 million in business, several $100 million in business. They're not going to put their eggs in a basket for something that they're only going to make a couple $1 million on.
Fair enough. All right.
At least they'll shove it down our throats.
All right. Well, agent to agent, we'll see where that goes. We'll kind of keep you up to date as that develops. But like I said, I'd be betting on that one. So we talked a little bit about MCP a second ago, and of course, I don't know, maybe it was 2 weeks ago that we talked about it, because either that or it's just been a crazy week, because MCP just like caught fire. I mean, it was everywhere. Yes. And insane. And we talked about it even at the very beginning, that there were gaps from day one that, and I think in fairness, Anthropic acknowledged there were gaps. It wasn't like they're out there saying, hey, this thing is baked and ready for prime time. But there was a woman by the name of Elena who did a post on Medium that has arguably the best title I have seen for a tech article in a really long time. The title of this article is "The S in MCP stands for security." And of course, there is no S in MCP. And so it was like this brilliant, just like way of identifying the gap. And so, it goes on to point out that there's all kinds of potential risks with MCP. And, again, there was no surprise here. We knew that from day one that this was something that was going to have to be solved for. I do think the article does a really good job of pointing out that maybe the severity of that is a little bit bigger than people have counted on. And why it probably means there's going to be more time, that it's going to take more time to really get this off the ground in a meaningful production kind of way, which of course is impactful to what we just talked about with agent to agent. Is, well, agent to agent doesn't exactly rely on MCP. It is as a complementary, and you're going to have a hard time fully realizing one without the other, I would say, because if agents can't reliably connect to the underlying systems of record, then having them communicate with each other doesn't do much good. So, I think they sort of go hand in hand. So, there was nothing groundbreaking in here for me other than the fact, oh yeah, this is maybe a little bit more than I was really thinking through. But I mean, did you have a reaction? What was your take on it?
Yeah, so I think the big lesson here is even with something as cool as model context protocol, when we're thinking about augmenting models, we have to remember that there's a lot that is not in place in terms of the basic validation, authentication, and auditability of the activity that we are doing right now. We are building all this from scratch. This is the Wild West. And unless something is literally defined as existing and is defined as something part of your governance or compliance structure, you should assume that it is not there right now from a model perspective. Everybody who is working on the model or agent side will tell you that they are building the plane as they're trying to land it or fly it. This is really tricky stuff, quite honestly, and we are seeing a lot of stuff, work going directly from research and development to productization, because the market is demanding it. People are demanding change so quickly. Going for a second back to Google Next, part of the challenge with the Google Next announcements is that it was this big blend of stuff where a lot of it had been announced 6 days ago. So people were saying, well, it's not new for Google Next because the cycle for tech updates is so fast now. And MCP is just another example of that. That although it's a very promising approach to be able to augment your models, it does not mean that it is fully enterprise ready from a pure compliance, governance, and security perspective. And you should definitely be on the lookout for prompt engineering, prompt injections, and basic threats to your model because those things, the protections have not inherently been built in from a native context.
Yeah, one of the things, and I think that nails it, right? That the lack of a native security self-controlling sort of apparatus is the gap here, right? So some of this, like when I go through the list of the items she pulls out, some of this I say, well, you can manage that on your end, right? Prompt injection as an example, right? Well, you can build safeguards against that. So it doesn't matter if the ingress point is coming out of an MCP server flow versus, someone actually just prompting somebody in. You can build those safeguards. But it does point out there's a handful of elements of it, right? One of the challenges with MCP, by definitions, it's an abstraction layer where we're sort of handing off some of the connection elements to this MCP server, because that's what the whole point is to make it easy. I just make this connection, hand it off. And one of the things that she calls it the rug pull, where effectively I have that connection, I looked at it, it looks good, but because I don't own the full definition of that definition can get changed in the back end, either by accident, or it can happen because there's something, they've got a security breach and something gets changed. And so that's, I think, the issue. And because there's no native sort of way of managing that within the MCP protocol, that is potentially a risk. So, it more than anything, I think it's a good reminder for your CIO. Like anything, don't get too swept up in the hype and the craze. I remain very bullish on MCP overall, but I think we are very early, and I think there's obviously what this points out is there's still a whole lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and the stuff that is coming out is not getting 6 months of testing like most enterprise software features typically do before they get brought out. This stuff is being invented and then shipped directly to you, and caveat emptor, and just be careful with what you're doing. You should probably have a little lab in place to be able to test all of this out before bringing it into production.
Well, it is. It's funny you say that. I don't know if we forget, but almost everything that we talk about, everything that gets released, these companies are always releasing it as a preview, as a, a test. It's like, that's always the case, and because it
Mhm.
is moving so fast. So speaking of some of the challenges with security and how you manage against that, there's an interesting, I guess it's an email newsletter that I get from Wired that caught my eye. It's called the AI Lab. Author is Will Knight, and in it, he interviewed a gentleman by the name of Zico Coulter, who is he leads a research group at Carnegie Mellon,
Mhm.
and I guess he's well known as basically someone who sort of pokes holes in AI security. And more than anything, I mean, the article is quite interesting. It's an interview which I normally hate. I don't know why, but I just don't like written interviews. But basically went through a whole bunch of different things. But I thought the part that was really interesting is this idea that when it comes to agentic systems, that we sort of need a new view of game theory to start really figuring out the security components, because you have all these same security risks, some of the same security risks that we just talked about in the previous article, um, that that we can't contemplate in the same way that we've historically approached this, because we assume that it's a human actor. And now suddenly we potentially have an AI actor, or an agent that is actually on that drive of interaction. And so having this new approach to how we are looking at it from a security standpoint may be necessary. And so it was just sort of really an interesting, again, not my sweet spot in terms of kind of where I play, but it always makes me sit up and pay attention as I'm trying to process what all of this means. I mean, did you take anything from this?
Yeah. I remember in B school, we did a lot of games that like game theory, John Nash type exercises when we would be doing things like pricing or marketing or go to market or competitive launches, because we were trying to figure out how are we either incentivized to do things that are net win-win or lose-lose, where we lose less than our competitor does, and being able to make rational decisions from this. And part of the challenge there is, of course, we had a definition of rationality based on how businesses were supposed to do work. And AI doesn't necessarily have those same sets of rationality in place. AI actually tends to be value neutral and simply is trying to finish the task that you are assigning to it, regardless of value or concept. And I think that's a challenge that we are still dealing with right now in the real world, because we are anthropomorphizing AI to some extent and assuming that it has the same assumptions or business goals that we do, when AI really doesn't. It has not been pre-programmed or pre-trained or pre-weighted to necessarily care about how to actually run a business or to support human goals. So we have this game theory issue where we are trying to do a win-win scenario with where one side doesn't even agree with us on what a win is.
Yeah, it is. Well, what's funny about this whole train of thought is we sort of come full circle, because this is the root of the sort of movie version of the AI risks, right? And that you have an AI system that recognizes that it's going to optimize for this. The easiest way is to eliminate humans, right? That kind of
Would you
mentality,
like
right?
to play a game? Yes.
Right. And yeah, obviously that's not what he's saying here, but what he is saying is that the fundamental idea that underlies that big, the Hollywood movie concept is actually true, and that is that if we're going to focus on how we secure these systems, we need to re-envision the game theory model, because the same things that we as humans value and the way we would evaluate a situation, an AI agent not only will not, right? They don't have the same foundation, the same base. Um, but because they operate with this degree of autonomy, with the fact that there's sort of black box and that we don't really understand, because it's not programmatic, it's not A leads to B, we have to start re-envisioning this. So, to his credit, he's not saying there's an answer. He's basically saying we need a fresh look at this to try
Mhm.
to figure out how we can prepare for this. And I think it's a very this is going to come to a head. I think that some of the concern around agentic AI is overblown, in that most agentic AI right now is what I'll call barely agentic. I mean, as a vendor in this
Yes.
space, we run into this all the time. Well, people talk about, oh, our agents, and I like start probing. It's like, what agent? That's an algorithm at best, right? It's not an agent, not in the way I define it or think about it. So we're still very embryonic, but that's a very temporary state, right? As we fast forward here 12, 18 months, they're going to be much more powerful, much more capable, much more autonomous. And these concerns and risks are going to absolutely be very real. And the concern right now is, I think, that the pace of change is outrunning the pace of security. And so, I think it's definitely something that is just worth evaluating and considering. If you're an enterprise leader, this needs to be on radar.
Yes. And I think it's always important to remember that AI's conception of the world is limited and not as complete as a human's. Right now, we call those differences hallucinations, for lack of a better word. But what we're really saying there is that the AI model is less complete of a definition of reality than what we have. And it's important to know what the AI's definition of that is if you're planning to use that AI.
Yeah, well, and I'll give you a very simple example on that topic when it talks about the game theory concept, right?
Mhm.
So, one, and I don't remember where I read this, but I was reading up on it was something that was talking about the difference between the way humans interact and the challenge of the problem we have with the way we as humans look at something and the way an agentic solution might look at it and why we have a disconnect. And that is that if I tell you, hey, I need your help. Can you go handle this for me? And I give you a 2-line instruction, like, there's this book called Data for the People that's behind you, right? I need you to write a report, a 3-page report for me, that I can get to my board,
Mhm.
right? If I already give you those instructions and say, hey, do this for me, you're going to look at me and go, hey, I'm going to have my name on it, my reputation. There's a whole lot of value. There's no way in heck I'm going to, because I don't have enough information to act on.
Right.
What is this report about? Why are they asking for it? Who's on the board? What's the context, right? All of these other questions you would need. And you wouldn't try to give me a response because there's a negative impact to you personally, to your reputation, just to your time, right? For doing all of this without that component, right? If I give that exact same prompt to an AI, it's not going to ask me anything. It's going to just give me an answer, right? It's not going to do that same thing that we as humans do. And that is fundamentally driven by that value equation, right?
Mhm.
That there is no cost to it. It has no reputation to protect. It has no sense of this being any use of its time or energy. So it's going to spit something out. And that's the fundamental difference. And what I love is that's really what this idea of game theory is trying to account for,
Mhm.
right? As far as if we start thinking about it in those terms. So anyway.
Right. Excellent.
So speaking of consequences, game theory, we're going to wrap up, or at least for our meaty subjects, on your favorite topic, and that is tariffs.
Oh, yeah.
So we have three articles, and really we want to look at this from the perspective of the CIO and how do you prepare for this, or should you be preparing, and what is it? And I'm just going to sort of team all up and let you go to town. The first is actually a LinkedIn post by a gentleman by the name of David Politis. He is the CEO in residence for a venture capitalist firm that I'm a big fan of here in New York City, called Workbench. And he basically put this out. And let me tell you, it was pretty stark. It's like, this is war, prepare now, don't wait. And it was like, hey, this is real and you better be acting right now. And then there's another article from CBS talking about like the ramifications on the consumer tech side and how much an iPhone could cost and why it's not as simple to simply say, oh, we'll produce it in the US. And then finally, a CIO Dive article that was talking about how the tariffs are causing CIOs to really start looking at IT budgets circumspect and just really kind of scrutinizing what they're doing. So just sort of queued it all up for you. They're all sort of part of the same thing here. What do you think? If you're a CIO today, or if you're advising a CIO today, what would you be telling them to do with all of this?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to remember that So this is the Trump administration is definitely one that works very flexibly. I'll just say it that way. Try to keep it polite. And but it means that any one policy, you don't know how long it's going to last. You don't know how long it's going to stay consistent. But you have to take them seriously. So if he says 125% tariff on China, you have to have a business scenario where that is in place. And it might hopefully it's a day and then it goes away because I think that's very disruptive for business, frankly. But it could be a month, it could be a year, and you have to have an idea of what does your business do if you're going to have to deal with this for an extended amount of time. And in some cases, this is really difficult because we know that, for instance, working with China, we don't just work with China because they're cheap, but because they have more discrete manufacturing resources than anybody else on the planet, and they know how to build stuff in ways that we don't. We just don't have several million people who understand, die and discrete manufacturing in the way that China does. So we have to figure out what that means. Are we willing to suck up the tariff costs? Do we have what level of backup manufacturing can we do for our specific devices, and how does that affect our supply chain, and what does that mean in terms of what we can model from a digital perspective? Like these are all backup plans that we need to have in place, and I think that scenario building is probably the most important thing that we can do right now, with the understanding that things are going to change, and probably things that you've never had to consider before in your lifetime are going to change.
It is interesting. So the article, the LinkedIn post, it was targeted at tech companies, right? Like founders of startups. But I will say, I think if you're a CIO, much of this is going to ring true. And he said the exact same thing, making these plans and looking at these as contingencies, in terms of how you operate. And I think from a CIO's perspective, and I think the CIO Dive article does a pretty good job of addressing this as well. But it just speaks to the fact that, and this is the part that I guess frustrates me with the way the Trump administration is handling it, is that it speaks to the fact that what is not going to happen anytime soon is stability, which is what we all want. We want predictability, right? We want to know what's going to happen. And like even this pause, well, it's a 90-day pause and he still put 10% on. And so I think we're going to see across the board, everyone sort of going into these holding patterns. And so if you're a CIO, the question is, well, how do you manage against that? Now, the one thing I will say is that I do think it also, because I always believe this, is that these times of turmoil, in fact, I think this is why you're looking for a job right now. These times of turmoil create opportunity, they create change. And so if you're a CIO, I think you need to be trying to stake out two different points here, two different points of ground is the word. On the one hand, you want to create as much flexibility and adaptability as you can. Don't commit to long-term contracts, probably less so with us. You want to give yourself as much flexibility as you can, but you also want to be making smart investments and taking advantage of, if all of your competition is standing still and holding, and you see an opportunity to leapfrog by making a smart investment, then it's a great chance to do that. And so I think it's going to be a difficult period of time. I think it's almost impossible, though, that we're not going to see increases in cost because, this 90-day pause aside, we still are seeing a 10% increase. This article that you pointed out says even if the iPhone is moved out of China and they're coming from India, it still raises the price by almost 15%. And there is no option for literally anybody in the tech space to really build anything here in the US. That same article talks about if you put that iPhone and made it in the US, it goes from $1,000 to $3,500. I mean, there's just no pragmatic mechanism to accomplish that. So we're in for this. And I think what is really interesting or challenging that I think people aren't anticipating is that this is going to trickle into the cloud players sooner rather than later, right? Because unlike an enterprise, if you were buying capital equipment, you could just put everything on hold. These cloud companies have no choice but to keep buying. And that means the costs are going to rise. And that means they're going to see an incremental cost increase across their entire customer base to compensate for that. So I think if you're like most CIOs heavily invested in the cloud, you should just be budgeting for increases because they're going to happen. So, I think it's an interesting time. I think there's a lot of challenges in front of it. And I guess we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and right now we're seeing this temporary freeze on computers and I think video games and basically anything that is related to software and computing. But again, it's a temporary freeze. I do think that if you have any hardware components or custom servers, things like that, you have to seriously look at your options for India-based or maybe Vietnam-based or other countries that are outside of China for your sources. We're going to play this weird, whack-a-mole game of picking the country with the lowest tariffs and decent manufacturing capabilities to be able to fab and customize what you're looking for. If you are a buyer at scale of computing, you've got to be looking at that. Or even just PCs, if you're buying 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 PCs a year, because that's your enterprise.
We're definitely going to see it on, any of that equipment. We're definitely going to see it.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to close as always. We try to do something light or a little bit silly or whatever. And one of our favorite topics is always DOGE.
DOGE.
And so, yeah. And so we have one, although as you said it in the pre-production notes, maybe one that we can agree on. So what is it?
Yes, so the most recent DOGE cuts that have made the news are about digging into the Defense Department and the Pentagon cutting. They're saying they're cutting $5 billion in costs, including consulting services to Accenture, Deloitte, Booz Hamilton, some of the biggest names in government consulting. And so that's going to be one of the areas that they are seeking to cut costs. And at first glance, I think we have all seen the bills of a gigantic Accenture deployment where you get charged $30 million and it seems like everybody's making $250 an hour or no matter
Or
how
more, lots
trivial,
more.
no matter how trivial their job is. Oh yeah, if you're talking about somebody senior, oh yeah, the sky's the limit, of course. So I although I'm not a big fan of what Doge has done overall, I think there's been a lot of big cuts that took away a bunch of our capacity to do things like science while having very little in savings. I think this particular area is one where you needed a Doge type situation where an organization had this level of capability to cut to be able to reduce some of this government contracting and consulting that probably is a little bit out of control, to be honest.
I think it's obviously real dollars. I mean, $5 billion is definitely not nothing. The hard part is the Pentagon budget. That means it's less than or just over 0.5%, so less than 1%. But I think it's real, and I agree. I mean, we've all seen these. And I mean, my only concern is, these companies, many of them anyway, don't just provide consulting; they provide outsourcing and other services. That if that's what it is, then that's not nearly the same. That money is just gonna, because that work has to get done. But if it's just consulting, oh my gosh, completely agree with you. And so I guess we'll have to see if this turns out to be good or not. But definitely not great if you're Accenture, Deloitte, and Booz Allen. But overall, I think it's hey, maybe a bright shining beacon of hope for our relationship with Doge. I'm not going to hold my breath on that one, but
we'll see if that's the case. Miracles happen sometimes. But on that note, thank you so much for joining us. This has been another This Week in Enterprise Tech. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe, like, follow, comment, and let us know what we should be looking at for next week. And we'll have a couple surprises for you next week as well, as Charlie goes on his adventures in domestic affairs.
moving.
And we have a new guest host.